Today I'm going to talk about transitional phases, resensitization, and long-term planning. So, transitional phases play a major role in the training process and are necessary to further progress in the long term. What the role of transitional phases are a couple of things, and I think that over the last several years of my own coaching experience, I've noticed a shift in my thinking to emphasize and put more care into the use of transitional phases. When I was young, I had basically no respect for the idea of a transition, no respect for the idea of taking a day off or deloading or any of those things. So I'm coming from completely the opposite end of the spectrum here than from a lot of people that probably have a better or had a better grasp of this when they started. But basically, transitional phases offer a couple of solutions to certain training problems that I think are really overlooked. And some of those are basically the recovery, rehabilitation, and resensitization. So what I'm talking about there is recovery. We know that you're basically stopping a training cycle. You finish a training cycle. You're importing or you're incorporating a higher volume, low intensity, high variation exercises. You're working on more general qualities. All of that facilitates the idea of recovering. And recovery is a very broad term, but basically a return to homeostasis, a return to the state that you were in prior to competition. So after competition, you're not going to have very good work capacity. You're not going to have really high fitness levels for high volume training, for the kind of stuff that's going to develop and build your results because you were peaked. So transitional phases basically offer that exactly what they say, transition between peaking and accumulation or preparatory blocks that need to follow in order for you to train for your next competition. Rehabilitation is another aspect of transitional cycles that is probably more a byproduct of you needing to do a transitional phase after you've got some kind of injury, or you're coming back, or you're rehabbing something minor, or something, maybe even not super major, but a boo-boo here and there that requires time away from something. So those two things are pretty obvious. Those two aspects of transitional phases, I think, are very straightforward. We all get that. You have to rest. You have to recover. You got to fix anything that's broken, so on and so forth. But the one aspect that I think gets overlooked a lot and is probably more, in my mind, more important than I had realized before is the idea of resensitization. And what I'm talking about when I'm referring to the idea of resensitization is that you are going to become resistant. Your body is going to become resistant to certain types of training the more you do them. In fact, it becomes resistant to anything you continually apply to it, any stressor. So if you're doing really heavy weights and you're going from you're constantly doing sets of 5 or whatever, eventually you're going to become resistant to that. The adaptive resistance will start to build up. You'll start to get less and less benefit from it. Now there's a bunch of different options to try and prevent this or circumvent this through variation and different types of training structure, et cetera, et cetera. And transitional phases really play a big part in this, because what you're going to want to do is have a resensitization phase where you become your body, you do certain types of training in order to resensitize yourself to higher volumes of training. And it goes without saying that the peaking phase probably already does this to some degree. Once you go from high intensity, low volume, immediately to higher volume phases, there's going to be the high intensity training is going to resensitize you to somewhat to the high volume stuff. But a transitional phase does this in a more effective and safer way, in that you are planning for this to happen, and you're planning to incorporate other things into the phase, into the block, to get this to happen. That's going to include stuff like, more variations of different exercises, more general qualities being trained, more, different types of muscular work being done, different kinds of activities and sport activities outside of weightlifting. All those things will sort of build up, and all of those things work in conjunction to create a situation where you're now resensitized to being able to do much, much higher volumes. The high volume training you do after the transitional phase should be, you should receive that well. Your body is going to adapt to it well because of that transition phase. So I think it's really important for us to remember that transitional phases do play a very important role and play a big role from that perspective. If you want your training to be more effective, you can either find a way to do more training, more specific training, or you can find a way to make yourself respond more sensitive or be more sensitive to the training you're already doing. The downside to this, and I think the sort of issue you could run into is that, yeah, well, you could just take time off after a meet and have this totally, almost like deloading or detraining kind of effect happening, where you go up you go forward 3 steps, then you take 3 steps back, or you might take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and you're never really getting ahead, because while you're resensitizing yourself by doing no training during a transition, you're also not maintaining your fitness levels. So something to remember is that a transition that has no training in it is basically just an ineffective way of trying to achieve that same result. So practical implementation, I would say, for transitional phases and some just general stuff to kind of remember. I would say in my mind that there's a few different types of transitional phases. And these are not necessarily universally used, and it's not something that I would really define a lot, but I think it's important to kind of grasp what it is that you're doing with your transitional phases and kind of have an idea as a coach in your mind or written down, what is the purpose of this transitional phase. And the 3 kinds I have in my mind are basically a recovery or bridge type, and this is basically just planned rest after a competition, to allow for recovery and a faster return to normal training. It's the standard, let's take time off, let's build off of general qualities. It's best planned for after less intense training months, or between 2 shorter training cycles. So if you have a training cycle leading up to a minor competition, and then you want to take a month bridge or recovery time between that and the training for another minor competition, or maybe a more major competition, this is a good type of block. And it's really just a shorter version of a transitional period. The main objectives would just be to recover and decay all your fatigue from the previous cycle, kind of almost like a long deload. I wouldn't say this is a good time to do a bunch of really high, really large variations in training, because it's probably going to be between 2 and 4 weeks long at most. So understand that's more of a singular recovery block. The second would be a rehabilitation type. This is the same as we talked about earlier. It's more that it's probably something forced. You obviously don't plan for injuries. So you've tweaked something, or you've got boo-boos and you need to heal them. Then, a full training block devoted to taking time away from normal training, to do this. It's something that I would say is worthwhile only if you're training excessively hard or really, really hard initially, and you will be better off doing a recovery type block rather than just training around the injury. And this is to say, a situation where this would occur, I would say, is if you have a really important not important training cycle coming up. If you're training, if it's like post nationals training or whatever, post AO training, whatever it is, and you don't have another meet planned for a solid 4 to 6 months, or something important for 4 to 6 months, then this would be a good time to, if you're hurt or if you have the time, take a little bit of time to recover and devote all of your time to it. The reason this thing exists, or the reason I would say this exists, and it's not just included in any other type, is that if people are trying to train around something, and that creates a situation where the entire training process kind of falls apart because they're sacrificing this exercise for that exercise or this for that, and they can't maintain the training effect. This would be common, I would say, if you hurt your back, if you hurt your knee. You're just going to be so limited in certain things, or you hurt like a wrist, like you just can't do a lot of stuff. With a wrist, you could probably still pull and squat and whatnot. But if if you tweak your back, like you don't really have a lot of choices. So it might be intelligent to take a transitional period to facilitate the healing of that. And then, you can also take care of a bunch of other things at the same time. And then finally, it would be like a full off season. This is something that I think doesn't exist very much in lifting here. People don't take a long time off. They don't take time away from certain exercises. Squatting comes to mind. While we know that squatting is not the be-all and end-all in weightlifting, 99% of coaches' programs probably don't represent that same thought process. They probably have squatting programmed probably somewhere around 3 to 5 times a week, 52 weeks a year, or 40 weeks a year, when you actually take into account the taper weeks and whatnot, deloads. But understanding that, like, there's no time. How many times are we taking a full off season? And that off season might be 3 transitional months, where one of those months, maybe the first month of that or the middle month of that 3-month period, has no direct back squat or front squat in it. Maybe all of the leg training is done by running and jumping, and maybe some single leg type, I guess you'd call it like general, like muscular and balance kind of stuff, but nothing heavy squatting focused. I think that as an off season, as a long-term development tool, this makes a lot of sense. You're going to resensitize yourself to training the squat. In all of my experience with top lifters, the 2 that come to mind that I would say, and even probably 3, that were the weakest in the squat, generally did the best and do the best when they have periods of complete cessation of squatting. Alyssa Ritchie and Alex LaChance, both not strong squatters, and taking time away from squatting by, Alex took months from squatting, and Alyssa would take at least a month off after big meets, produced significantly better results in the squat afterward because they resensitized to that kind of training. They probably, it probably goes without saying, I wouldn't know the science behind this, but I'm going to make a bullshit, I'm going to make some bullshit up right now. But I would say that it's probably those people that struggle in the squat may end up in a place where they're for whatever reason, they are resisting, they develop a resistance to that training mechanism faster than other people. It could be that it's the movement. It could be that it's the way that their body responds to that movement. Who knows? But potentially they develop a resistance. And if not, they definitely performed better anecdotally when they had, periods of time that completely eliminated squatting from the program. So I would say that just basic guidelines for transitional periods outside of giving prescriptions would be a reduction in heavy strength work is the first and foremost thing. A lower average intensity of all exercises. That K value has to come down. In a distribution of higher repetition sets, meaning more volume allocated to high rep sets above 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 reps. And then little to no lifts distributed in the 90% range and above. Again, obviously this makes sense if you're already going to be at lower relative intensity. And then large variation in exercise selection are key, is that you want to have a myriad of different things going on for a bunch of different reasons. But primarily the variation is very beneficial for people participating in weightlifting because it's super fucking boring. And anything you can do to keep motivation very high, especially in these off-season kind of things, is beneficial. When people come back looking forward to training, you're definitely going to see better results from them. So that's my 2 cents on that topic, and wait for the next one, I guess.